Hi everybody, this is our last lesson before we start class in person or online, depending on which section you're enrolled. But anyway, the topic is going to be the colonial lifestyle and society that developed in the 17th century. So our objectives for this lesson are to discuss the characteristics of the different colonial regions, New England, Middle, Chesapeake, and South, to explain the reasons for the transition from indentured servitude to slavery, and to explain how the slave system impacted Southern culture and how Southern culture impacted the lives of slaves. So I want to start by first talking about lifestyle in New England. We talked about it was families came over, they were escaping, Puritans were escaping persecution starting in the 1620s and 1630s and continued on. In early 1640s, the Great Migration in England ended, and the English Civil War was over, and a new government was set up that was friendly towards the Puritans, and uh, we're going to see basically a stop to the emigration. There's no reason to leave England. And within 10 to 15 years, we're going to see several challenges to Puritanism in New England. First off, there was a decrease in religious devotion. The first generation of Puritan children that were born here just didn't have the motivation of the trial that their parents had endured in England. They had never been religiously persecuted. And as a result, they, they were not as intensely into the church as their parents would have been. Furthermore, there was a long life expectancy in New England, and the young people were very frustrated by the large number of elders that were judging them, which also turned them away from Puritanism. And, as the population went and spread westwards into outlying farms, they were out of control of the church in many ways. And so what happened, essentially conversions decreased. And so the church, Puritans are now called the Congregational Church, responds in two ways. Number one was something called the Jeremiad. The Jeremiad was taken from the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, and it was essentially used by preachers to scold parishioners for their waning piety. It didn't help. In fact, conversions continued to decrease. And so troubled ministers found it another way that tried to make some type of a solution. And this was something known as the halfway covenant. The problem was that, if your parents were church members and you were baptized, but you didn't participate in church membership, then what happens to your children? And so the halfway covenant essentially allowed that children could be baptized as long as their parents were baptized. Their parents, just by the nature of being baptized, were still part of the congregation. Um, and this kind of also, once again, kind of divided New England, especially clergy. A lot of sincere clergy felt very opposed. They felt their church was becoming less pure, that they were just trying to increase, church membership. On the other hand, I think some of the other clergy were trying to deal with the issue of more and more people not participating in the church. And remember, church members vote. They're the ones who make the laws. And the fact that there was no more migration after 1640 meant that, it was shrinking. The colony was successful, but the Puritan population wasn't growing. Ultimately, by 1689, Massachusetts loses its charter. A new royal charter that is created doesn't create a close relationship between church and state. The Anglican Church was now allowed in, and we see that the Congregational Church, while still influential, was not the only game in town. Probably the other factor that led to the real issue that kind of killed the religious devotion in New England were the Salem witch trials. And so Massachusetts had suffered a good bit of upheaval in the 1680s and 1690s as they went from their charter, when the charter was revoked and they went to the king. And we're going to see this lead to widespread paranoia. So keep in mind that everybody at this time believed in witches. Pretty much all the time. It was not uncommon for Europeans and colonists to really believe that the devil worked magically through witches in the real world. And when in Salem, they really didn't address the problem of the loss of the government charter, and they didn't have the government to try the witches. And so the first accusations actually began when young girls, after listening to voodoo tales from a black servant who had been in the Caribbean, began behaving oddly. And the witch hunt resulted in a reign of horror ensued after certain older women were allegedly witches. Accused persons were brought to trial before a special court. Um, 19 people were hanged, one was pressed to death, 2 dogs were hanged. And a lot of the Puritan clergy that had supported the witch trials saw their prestige weakened as a result. One other thing, and I put this map up here for you to look at, while we can sit there and bring the religious and the tales from the Caribbean and those components into it as well, if you look at the map of Salem Village and the outlying Salem town, the majority of the accusers lived on the west side. The majority of those accused lived in either Salem town or on the prosperous west side. East side. And because of that, there's an economic component to who was accusing and who was being accused. In many respects, if you look at just the data, which is what a historian would do, looking at this map, it tended to lead the direction that there is an economic correlation. Those that were being accused were those that were generally more prosperous. Regardless, at the end of the Salem witch trials, we see kind of most New Englanders realizing they had made a mistake. And eventually, we're going to see by the 1700s, the Puritan churches allow anyone in regardless of conversion factor. And this continues on into the 17th century, 18th century. And by into the 18th century, New England is no longer solely Puritan. This secular ruling elite was not as identified with it. They began to participate in more philosophical and intellectual changes. Public morality was not as regulated by the 1700s, and it was regulated big time in the early 1600s. Adultery, public drunkenness, missing church services were all punished by fines and even more in some cases. And despite the fact that the church does decline, the Congregational Church was still the most successful religious establishment in the colonies as well. Moving on to the Puritan contributions and what we learned about this. You guys probably started learning about it if you first took your first history course in elementary school. Let's talk about some of the contributions to society. What exactly did they give us? And there's actually several things. So first off, probably most important, the seat of democracy. The Puritans, while the Virginia legislature, House of Burgesses, was created in Jamestown, we're going to see democracy at town meetings in New England within the Congregational Church. And these town hall meetings where freemen met together and each man voted was, an early pure form of democracy. New England villagers, would meet to elect their officials, they would appoint schoolmasters, attend to civic issues like road repair. And so we see this self-government, this local government idea that develops with the Puritans and comes over with them. We also see a morality and conservatism in lifestyle as well. Puritanism in many cases provided unity of purpose and concern for the moral health of the community. And in many respects, part of Puritanism was the idea of the perfectibility of humankind and society. Puritans, although slavery existed in New England, in small numbers, New England didn't lend itself to the type of agriculture that could afford a slave system. Consequently, many Puritans argued very much against slavery on moral grounds, and a few Quakers were also very opposed to slavery. Also, what we'll see are, they want to change to the ways of, English society. They abhorred the excesses that existed. They wanted to purge church society of all extravagance, of anything Catholic, what they call popery. And they became really known on both sides of the Atlantic for their very strict codes of conduct. Everyone is basically responsible for the behavior of everybody else. God could punish a society if one of its members didn't conform. Houses were built closely together, and in many respects, they, could watch each other. There were like laws governing the Sabbath and recreational activities. An example in New Haven, Connecticut, a young married couple were fined for kissing in public. Yet we talk about this, they were actually not necessarily prudes in the sense that we sometimes think. Within marriage, they were somewhat relaxed about their relations. Drinking was okay, getting drunk was not. The most common beverage was beer because they didn't trust the water. They also drank cider. In fact, this will be a part of it as well. And so we see, despite this, increased morality, these, like I said, fines and, punishments for missing services, swearing in public, the Puritans did adapt and moved on. And they spread these ideas throughout as they moved westward. Another big idea that comes and has really shaped American identity is the Protestant work ethic. And this was kind of a byproduct of the theology of Calvinism. They believed that they were God's chosen people. They were predestined. They had worked extremely hard to build their city on a hill. The fact that they didn't have good soil kind of forged the characteristic of frugality and hard work. And, essentially part of their ideas were that those who worked hard and succeeded were seen favorably by God. And this idealism became a national symbol and a symbol of, work hard to gain the American dream. Another characteristic of New England and Puritanism in general was the education system. The first college, Harvard, was founded in 1636. In the South, the first college was in Virginia was William and Mary in 1693. And what we did, we see a large per capita number of ministers in all the colonies who are educated in New England as well. There's also the first Massachusetts school required the 3 R's in knowledge of the Bible become widespread. Towns that had more than 50 families were legally required to provide an elementary education. That didn't become the norm in Europe until the late 1800s, over 200 years later. And part of it was, especially early on, the majority of adults knew how to read and write because they needed to know how to read the Bible. And like I said, probably the most important, significant reason why New England became the most literate section of the country. We're also going to see the small villages and farms formed the basis for a very tightly knit society. Part of it was that it was necessary to provide security from bordering Indians, but new towns were legally chartered by colonial authorities, and they distributed land to entrusted proprietors. People had to require general courts for a township that would include a minister. Towns were carefully planned with a meeting house, town hall surrounded by houses. There was a village green where the militia could practice. Families would receive parcels of land. It was very planned versus in the Chesapeake, where expansion was kind of random and individualistic, not quite as communal. And then regarding the Puritan family, as I said early, it was less deadly in Massachusetts than it was in the southern colonies, and the cooler weather and clean water meant less disease. Even compared to life expectancy in England, it was 10 years higher. It was actually 70 years old. People who came to New England generally tended to come as families rather than individuals. And the natural reproduction was healthy from the beginning. There was a booming birth rate due to early marriage. Women generally produce babies about once every 2 years until menopause. And there was that dread of death, but there were some very large families. Some families had over 20 children by the same mother. Whereas Virginia, it was unlikely that a child would ever live their entire childhood with both parents and ever meet a grandparent. These extended families became normal in New England. In fact, the concept of grandparents really came from New England. And it was just a strong colonial structure going into it. With that said, about the middle colonies, and we actually went over pretty much most of this in our last PowerPoint, but I just want to kind of reiterate some of the features of the middle colonies. The middle colonies, once again, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. I would focus on Pennsylvania. But these colonies were known as the bread colonies because they were fertile. They had broad expanse of land. They exported grains. They also exported fruits and veggies. It was a very desirable land that came together. There was shipping and commerce. It was much less aristocratic than New England and the South, except for New York was maybe the one holdout for aristocracy. But most landholdings were very intermediate in size. Fewer industries than New England, way more than in the South. In many ways, it went the middle way. And the population was actually, more middle-class lifestyle and more ethnically mixed, more religiously tolerant, more democratically controlled. There were some factional issues, but for the most part, as we see this is how it develops. And going back to Pennsylvania, I think we talked about the Quakers and the founding of it. I just wanted to reiterate that this is where we really see the, with Pennsylvania, we really see these characteristics. Pennsylvania was an advertised colony. They distributed countless pamphlets in England the Netherlands, France, and German land, promising freedom of belief, freedom of religion. And it's one of the reasons so many German immigrants came to Pennsylvania. A lot of the Amish, today we call the Amish, were the Anabaptists that were persecuted. And they were offered, liberal land policies and, no required military service. And so we see, this idea of Pennsylvania, um, this idea of religious tolerance become kind of the example for the middle colonies and for settlement in the middle colonies. And by 1700, Pennsylvania, was the third largest colony. Quaker elite still ran the colony at that point, but for the most part, there was, um, like I said, a mixed religious population. One thing that is going to, though, be an issue will be the backcountry. And the backcountry, for the most part, are the western lands. And as more and more land in the east becomes uh, taken by, bought by settlers, both the Native Americans who the Pennsylvania colony was buying land from, and other what we call squatters were going out west fighting over different lands. And ultimately, we're going to see this whole idea of especially the Scots-Irish come over to the west, this very independent backcountry that we're going to talk about in upcoming chapters. Moving on then to the Chesapeake, and just kind of going over a few more things there, kind of reiterate a little bit first of what your view. Remember, this is Maryland and Virginia. If you remember, early on, disease took a very heavy toll early on. Half of all born in early Virginia, Maryland did not live past the age of 20. And most, immigrants were single men, competing for extremely scarce women. Thus, women married early. Most marriages were destroyed by death within the first 7 years. Most didn't have that. Most children, didn't have two living parents throughout childhood, and most children never knew a grandparent as well. Yet the challenges, by the mid-1600s, those challenges become overcome. And by the late 17th century, 1670s, 1680s, the population was growing with its own birth rate. Virginia became the most populous colony with 50,000 people. Maryland, the third most, with 30,000. As we talked about earlier, the economy relied upon tobacco. The Chesapeake climate was conducive to it, but tobacco also is hard on the land, which meant that there was this constant shift westward for more and more land. And we briefly discussed, I believe, the headright system and indentured servitude, but I just want to kind of go over that. In order to attract people to Virginia, the headright system was issued in England. Whoever paid the passage of a laborer received the right to acquire 50 acres of land. And so, for the most part, a lot of indentured servants, agreed to a specified number of years of servitude in exchange for this transatlantic passage. And, they were eventually promised freedom dues, maybe some corn, some clothing, a small parcel of land if they were lucky. And this indentured servitude system was, as a system of labor, worked for a period. Importing slaves from Africa was too expensive, and Indians were too susceptible to diseases. And probably about 100,000 indentured servants were brought over by the planting class, which was about 75% of all the immigrants by 1700 in Virginia, Maryland. But eventually, as land grew scarce, masters reduced that land and freedom dues, and conditions grew harsher. Some, if they were misbehaving, would be punished by an extended term of service. And often when they were freed, they had no choice but to either work for their former master for a pitiful wage or to go out west. And as they went out west, they're going to be competing with Indians for land. And this is going to lead to one of the first and most serious rebellions in the colonies, what we call Bacon's Rebellion. Essentially, unable to own land, a number of impoverished and frustrated freedmen had mushroomed by the late 17th century, trying to go and squat on land in the West and fighting with Indians. And they felt that the Virginia government, was not helping them against the Indians. And so, as they were, basically doing this and fighting this, they were land hungry and they were poor. They wanted government protection, and the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, was seen as being too Indian friendly. In Berkeley's defense, not being friendly with Indians meant more money to pay for war, and this was something that Berkeley was trying not to do. And so Nathaniel Bacon was a 29-year-old upper-class landowner in the West. He was elected to the House of Burgesses. And essentially, when, he kind of got into this match with the governor, 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support Bacon, who insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians. Berkeley had labeled him a rebel. And the last straw, is, when Bacon leads about 1,000 Virginians who massacred friendly and hostile Indians, and hostile Indians, and chased Governor Berkeley from Jamestown. They then set the city on fire. And the nature of the rebellion was both anti-Indian but also anti-elitist. These were very common people. The rebels were mostly poor whites, former indentured servants, some black slaves joined as well. And it seemed as if civil war was imminent. It was going to continue in Virginia colonies until Bacon suddenly died of disease. The loss of Bacon meant the loss of leadership. Berkeley crushed the rest of the resistance, hanging 20 rebels, and ultimately led to some changes. Probably the most important long-term result were that the planters, those landed gentry, they sought less troublesome laborers, and they replaced the indentured servants. Probably the most significant reason, one of the most significant reasons we see in Virginia, the end really of indentured servitude, or the beginning of the end, and the beginnings of importation of slaves from Africa. The color line became an effective way for white Virginian planter class to control their slaves and to control their poor whites, who would actually feel at least superior to the blacks despite their poverty in many respects. Going into colonial slavery, we'll talk a little bit about colonial slavery and the slave trade, and I think it was a really good reading in Chapter 3 of the Yawp, if you've read it already. The slave trade, as far as what had happened, beginning in West African coast, they were originally captured by African coastal tribes who would trade them to European and colonial American buyers. And it was actually estimated that about 40% of slaves captured in the interior died on the route from the interior to the coast for the Middle Passage. But ultimately, we do know that, an estimated 50 million Africans died or became slaves during the 17th and 18th century. And of about 10 to 15 million Africans sent into slavery in the New World, 400,000 ended up in North America. The majority were actually sent to the West Indies or to Portuguese or Spanish South America. I think Brazil had the most, Portugal and Brazil, and the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean had a very significant number. And there should, what they call the Middle Passage. They essentially were human cargo in the hold of a slave ship. Take a look at these images. Between 20 and 30% of slaves died during the Middle Passage. The conditions of the Middle Passage were horrific. They were often chained by their neck and or extremities to the deck floor, packed into spaces about the size of a coffin. If they had to go to the bathroom, they had to lay on their own waist. In some cases, the next deck was only maybe about 1.5 feet above the deck floor. They couldn't turn over. They had to basically lay on their back. They were released, of course, during the day for some exercise, although they're very closely watched. And also keep in mind, it's hard to communicate. Many of these different tribes all spoke different languages, so they didn't have a common language to be able to really talk. Eventually, then they would arrive in like a slave port, such as Charleston, South Carolina had a giant market, as did Newport, Rhode Island, and they'd be sold on auction blocks. Now, most slaves to the present-day United States came after 1700, and like I said, I think we mentioned this earlier. The first slaves came to Jamestown in 1619, but the majority of labor in the Chesapeake were indentured servants. Yet by the 1680s, as South Carolina and North Carolina become colonies, we're going to see more and more. And the fact that indentured servitude after Bacon's Rebellion kind of saw its demise. Furthermore, in 1698, the Royal African Company lost its monopoly on the slave trade. And we're going to see, because of, instead of a monopoly that they had a monopoly itself, now some colonists could actually, especially from Rhode Island, took advantage ended as well. Keep in mind these ships were designed for not for comfort, but for the maximum amount of cargo, as much as they could hold, as well. And so we'll see, huge numbers throughout the 1700s. By 1750, slaves were over 50% of Virginia's population. By South Carolina, they were over 67% of their population. And what we're going to see, I'm going to show you this map here, which shows this trade, part of what they call the triangular trade routes. Ship materials would be sent to, let's figure it out, draw this in here, from the Americas to Europe, really into England, which is not on the map, where they made into processed materials. Those materials could be brought down and traded with the African slave traders, who would go and bring the slaves and then send them to the Americas. Like I said, British North America about 4%, the West Indies 42%, Brazil 38% overall. As far as slave life, it was probably a good rule of thumb throughout this course when we talk about slavery. The further south, the harsher slavery was. In the continental United States, it was especially South Carolina during this time was probably the most harsh. They lived in very brutal and isolated conditions on rice and indigo farming. And a fresh, continued imports of slaves was needed to sustain productivity. Those that were brought to Virginia with tobacco growing were a little less deadly. Generally in Virginia, plantations were larger and closer together, which afforded slaves more contact with friends and relatives versus the isolation on the South Carolina coast. But by early 1700s, around 1720, the slave population started to increase at a higher birth rate, more and more as well. There were family life. I think you read about the marriage system, and slave marriages were not viewed as legal compared with marriages of whites. And even in the vows, I think it was a till death or distance do us apart, and part became part of their vows. As far as the culture, we're going to see kind of a mixture of American and African pathways. Most slaves were converted to Christianity. And so religion somewhat became a combination of Christian beliefs with African rituals. The free afterlife really became a beacon of hope. We're going to see banjo, the bongo drum, imported to America from Africa. Ring shout dance is going to contribute, to the development of music and later on jazz. And we'll see even like languages, the Gullah language, which still exists on the islands off South Carolina, blended English with several African languages. We're also going to see, with a huge slave population, some rebellions. Approximately 250 instances when a minimum of 10 slaves joined in a revolt or conspiracy. You read about one in New York City where I think 23 blacks were executed and 12 whites were killed. Probably the biggest colonial rebellion was the Stono Rebellion in 1739, where South Carolina slaves tried to march to Spanish Florida, stopped by the militia, and were executed. Interestingly, no slave rebellion, despite the numbers, no slave rebellion in American history ever matched the scale of Bacon's Rebellion that we had just discussed. And then lastly, I want to talk about the slave codes. As Africans grew in numbers, many of the whites who felt threatened started passing laws that decreed the more oppressive institutions for slavery. Most of the common codes included that blacks and their children became the property for life of white masters. Some colonies made it a crime to teach literacy to slaves, and conversion to Christianity was not granted for freedom nor literacy. South Carolina inherited the slave codes from Barbados, which were just downright brutal, and these did influence codes in other countries. And slavery became the root of racism in the United States because it drew a distinct color line. The notion of inferiority based on skin color would be embedded in U.S. law until the 1960s and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That law would decree this. The last thing I want to talk about is just in general an overview of the colonial social pyramid through the 1700s. And this is really about 1750. It's a little bit later, but the development. So look at the very top. In New England, New York, you're going to have aristocrats, merchants, lawyers, officials, clergymen, especially like the New England middle colonies. And then in the South, your top class, really called them aristocrats as well, they were the planters, the planting class as well. Below, you'll see lesser professional men, and that's more in the middle colonies and New England colonies than the South. And then you'll see the yeoman farmers, those that own land or small farms, huge throughout, all the sections. Okay. The darker green, the lesser tradesmen, manual workers, hired hands, generally people who worked in an industry, unskilled workers, or those that worked on a farm that didn't own land in rural areas. And then indentured servants and jailbirds. People always chuckle at the word jailbirds, but a lot of people were sent here rather than jail. Georgia, for example, was a debtor's colony. Originally, Georgia, like Pennsylvania, forbade slavery. And I think Georgia might have also forbade alcohol for a brief period. I could be wrong there, because people were coming to start new lives as well. And then a full 20%, by 1775, a full 20% of the population of the 13 colonies were slaves, African slaves. Many were still being imported, but at this point also slavery had grown to natural reproduction as well. That is it for our last lesson before class begins next week. I look forward to meeting you all.